Welcome to the Equity and Inclusion During a Global Crisis, Supporting Employees in Unprecedented Times session at Women Transforming Technology. My name is Glenn Newman, and I'm one of the Diversity and Inclusion Program Managers on the team at VMware. I'm actually based in Atlanta, and in the spirit of inclusion, I wanted to let everyone know that we do have a closed caption option available. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for this session. Today we have Drs. Alison Wynn and Marianne Cooper, both from the Stanford VMware Women's Leadership Innovation Lab. At the lab, Dr. Wynn is a research associate whose research examines organizational policies and practices that may inadvertently create or reinforce inequity. In particular, Dr. Wynn studies recruiting practices, perceptions of cultural fit, flexibility programs, and gender equality initiatives in industries such as tech, management consulting, and academic medicine. Dr. Cooper was the lead researcher for Lean In, Women, Work, and the Will to Lead by Sheryl Sandberg. She is a contributor to leanin.org, a contributing writer to The Atlantic, and a LinkedIn influencer. She is an expert on gender, women's leadership, diversity and inclusion, financial security, and economic inequality. Please join me in welcoming Drs. Wynn and Cooper.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you for having us. We're really excited to be here, so to speak, today with you. And we're really excited to talk about a very important topic. We want to just say at the outset, please do respect confidentiality. Please keep what is said in this room, in this proverbial room. And we do want people to feel that it's a safe space where they can share. At the same time, we also want to remind you that do be aware everything is being recorded. So thank you. With that, we'll move on. Let's see, there we go. So the agenda of what we're going to be talking about today. First, we're going to talk about how challenges vary for different groups. So we're going to talk about gender, race, family composition and care responsibilities, and chronic illness, disability, and mental health. And then we're going to cover some emerging ideas and solutions that we've been hearing. We're going to talk about what companies can do, what leaders can do, and what managers can do. And then we're going to give a little bit of positivity, talk about some bright spots, areas where inclusion is actually looking pretty good, or things that may actually be turning around. And then we want to leave lots of time for discussion. We really want to hear from you all, things that are working, challenges you're facing, things like that. And then finally, we'll wrap up. So first, starting with how challenges vary for different groups. As I mentioned, we're going to talk about gender, race, family, and chronic illness, disability, and mental health. So starting with gender, almost 72% of mothers with children under the age of 18 are working. So we're seeing that the majority of mothers are working. And then among heterosexual couples, women continue to do more housework and childcare than men. And then we also find that women do more of what's called cognitive labor. So these are things like anticipating needs, identifying options for meeting them, deciding among options, and monitoring progress. So these are often things like, filling out forms for school, or making doctor's appointments, or, all of the sort of planning labor that needs to be done for the family. And these inequalities existed before COVID. And so if we think about a time like now, where there's so much of this labor to be done, so much cognitive labor, so much housework, so much childcare to be done, if women are doing more of this labor, that introduces a lot of important inequalities. And then we also see that there's a potential increased risk of domestic violence due to people being home a lot more than usual. And then we're also seeing some economic impacts of the recession on sectors with high proportions of women. So, if we look at very early emerging research, it's finding that compared to regular recessions, which often impact men's employment more than women's, we're actually seeing that the employment drop related to social distancing has a large impact on women's employment, or sectors with a lot of women. And in addition, if you think of closures of schools and daycares, things like that, it has massively increased childcare needs, which, as I've said, often falls on mothers. And so the effects of this crisis on working mothers is likely to be a sort of long-term persistent effect on their economic and career progression. We're also seeing that the unemployment rate for women is growing faster than for men. 60% of the jobs that were eliminated in March were women's, and women and people of color are more likely to be laid off than white men. So turning now to race, we're seeing an increase in xenophobia and specifically anti-Asian incidents. Asians and Asian Americans are experiencing microaggressions, racist attacks, threats of violence against themselves and others, and anxiety due to vicarious trauma or things that racist material they're encountering online. We're also seeing that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders reported more than 1,500 incidents of racism and discrimination related to COVID in the past month. For those of us in the Bay Area, 40% of the incidents took place in California, and about half of those took place in the Bay Area. So it's definitely happening where we are. And leaders can provide support for employees by speaking out against microaggressions. And there's some, in parentheticals, there's some specific ways of doing that, of speaking out against bias. So interrupting the bias when you see it happening, questioning it, educating those involved, and echoing the voices of marginalized groups. And leaders can address social stigma, and there's some guides there listed on the slide of sort of ways to do that. And then we're also seeing racialized patterns among COVID victims themselves. Black people make up 33% of all hospitalizations, which is more than double their share of the US population. We're also seeing that Black Americans are about 30% more likely than white Americans to have health conditions that exacerbate the effects of the virus. And we're seeing that Black workers are overrepresented in high contact essential services. So Black Americans may be more exposed to the virus, and they have worse outcomes when they are exposed or when they do contract it. And then we're seeing racialized economic impacts of the recession. Black Americans are almost twice as likely to live in counties and work in jobs at the highest risk of immediate and longstanding economic disruption. 39% of all jobs held by Black Americans are threatened by cuts in the wake of coronavirus, and that represents around 7 million jobs where workers are likely to be laid off, furloughed, or lose part of their income. And then looking specifically at single Black women, of the households led by single Black women, 38% live below the poverty line. So companies can do things like providing resources for employees who do get laid off, or as you move forward, making sure that layoffs aren't biased. So thinking about who is getting furloughed or fired in your organization. And then turning now to family composition and care responsibilities. So prior to the pandemic, 70% of workers reported having at least some issues addressing work and non-work activities. And this was true, before the crisis. I think the sort of quintessential thing we often think about when we think of family composition is childcare. So, in 63% of married couple families, both parents are employed. In single parent families, 74% of single mothers and 84% of single fathers are employed. So most parents are working. And then this is a real issue, because if we think about with schools and daycares closed, balancing work and childcare has become even more difficult. Definitely something I'm feeling personally. So, I think this is definitely top of mind for a lot of people. But it's not the only thing that's going on. When we think of family care and family composition, childcare is not the only challenge that families are facing. So another one is elder care. As we know, COVID has a real outsized impact on elders. And so a lot of people are really struggling with elder care or concern about caring for their elders. And then even for people who don't have family dependents that they're caring for right now, they may be facing unprecedented isolation as social distancing requires people to stay indoors, and they may be isolated from their families in a way that impacts them and their work. So, there's a lot of different types of family composition that can be creating challenges right now. And prior to the pandemic, only 40% of employers allowed employees to work some of their regular paid hours from home on a regular basis. Obviously, this is changing now. But in a more recent study conducted by Fast Company, when respondents were asked what resources they wish they had that their employers were not providing, 36% of moms and 27% of dads said they wanted more flexible working hours, and 20% of moms and 40% of dads said they wanted the ability to work remotely. So companies weren't really meeting employees' needs perfectly before the crisis, so it's even harder now. And companies really need to be stepping up and making sure that they're addressing these very present needs outside of work that are impacting work. And then turning now to chronic illness, disabilities, and mental health. So employees with chronic illnesses or disabilities may be especially concerned about getting access to care and support right now. Roughly 1 in 4 adults in the US has a disability. An estimated 60% of Americans have at least one chronic health condition that could make COVID more severe or more deadly. So this is definitely something that a lot of people are facing. And the need to avoid group settings may decrease regular access to care that employees are needing or accustomed to. And finally, there may be concern about medical biases. So ableism and ageism in COVID triage are a real concern, and the difficulty of getting access to care when you have other health concerns besides the virus. And then turning to mental health implications of the current situation. In a recent study, 67% of respondents reported higher levels of stress since this outbreak. And this includes employees across all levels of the organization. ICs, mid-level managers, C-level executives were all reporting similar levels of stress. Almost half of workers also said their manager wasn't tuned into their well-being. And of those, 69% said their mental health had declined, and 61% said they were less productive. And then this last bullet just floored me. 90% of respondents wanted at least weekly communication from their companies, 90%. So employees are begging their companies to allow them to stay connected. They really want their companies to be connecting with them, communicating with them, allowing them to stay connected and facilitating that. People also reported being appreciative when someone asked directly how they were doing. So people really want that personal check-in, and they really want to know that their companies are connecting, communicating, and responding. So now I'm going to turn it over to Marianne to talk about, I know this was all really depressing, so Marianne is going to come in with a bright light and talk about some emerging ideas and solutions.
Thanks, Alison. And as Alison's been talking, and as I continue to talk, please put in some questions or send us thoughts via chat, because our colleague, Carolyn Samard, who's the managing director of our lab, is monitoring all of that. And we can, once we're done with the formal part of this, this session, we can then open it up for a broader Q&A. So please keep submitting your ideas and your questions. And I'm going to be focusing more on the emerging ideas and solutions in this part of the session. We convened about a month ago now, I guess, although it's hard, time is so weird right now, it may have been longer than that, with many of our corporate partners of our lab to talk about many of the issues that we're talking about today. And we heard ideas, solutions. So what I'm going to go through now is just what's been top of mind at our lab among our staff, among our corporate partners, and things we're reading every day in the media. And I will just say that as a sociologist, what we're experiencing is real-time sociology. All of these demographic trends, the things that Alison just did an overview on of how things are playing out by race and by gender and by disability. We're trying to make sense of it as it's happening. So that's an emerging thing. So we really want you all to provide us with your thoughts too, so we can better make sense of this collectively. So I'll talk about what companies can do, leaders can do, managers can do. And then I'd love for all of us to talk about as well some ideas for what we can do as individuals to help each other get through it. To start off with companies, Alison, if you can go to the next slide, please. What we've really been talking about is that companies need to adjust their people processes, their policies, their expectations. So one concern we have is there's broadly pre-pandemic, one thing that workers, and particularly anyone with other responsibilities, struggled with is what's called the ideal worker norm. So the expectation that people are always available to work and they can work all the time and they don't have any outside commitments. And that seeps into expectations about productivity, how productive someone should be. And so right now we've got, schools closed, daycares closed, increase in all kinds of other cognitive labor in addition to childcare. So what's going to happen with assessments of productivity, assessments of performance. And so some organizations are really thinking through, well, what does this mean for the performance review? We heard from some organizations that they're delaying their performance reviews or canceling them altogether, or just using the performance review that someone got last year. I don't think there's a perfect answer to this, but what really needs to be thought through is that evaluating performance during a crisis, when there's unclear criteria about what productivity would mean, can really exacerbate these biases and increase employee stress. If we think about the motherhood penalty, which many of you may be familiar with, it's the assumption that mothers aren't committed to their work, that they're more committed to their children. Sometimes mothers and anyone else with caregiving responsibilities feels like they have to prove themselves again and again that they are committed. So companies need to think through how all of that might play out and how they would change or address the performance review in relation to that. Other things that companies, I think, are being somewhat innovative about, or some of them are being innovative about, is like people can't work as much as they used to, especially when they have children at home. And I think the younger the children, the harder this is going to be. My bet is that I'm placing sociological bets here, which is kind of an interesting thing to do, but I think it's going to be mothers of young children who are the most impacted. I have a 9 and 11-year-old, so it's hard, but they have some ability to function on their own, and that means I have more opportunity to work. So companies are doing things like one company we spoke with is giving their employees a bank of non-billable hours that they can kind of put towards anything: childcare, elder care, their own mental health needs and concerns. I think it was Microsoft offered up 12 weeks of paid family leave. So thinking about if we realize that people can't work the way they used to, then how are we going to change our sort of norms and practices around work hours? And an additional concern in this moment of a pandemic is thinking through paid sick leave. And one company that we talked with, they increased the amount of paid sick leave that they made available to employees and encouraged them to take it, both to care for their employees, but also this is a part of increasing public health, or making public health better, is giving everyone the green light to just not work when they're not feeling well, so we're not spreading any more sicknesses around than we need to. The next thing is to provide an infrastructure to work from home. Some organizations are creating work from home hubs, which includes resources about effective telework, or even kind of educational content or activities content for children. So parents who are struggling to figure out how to keep their kids occupied, it can be helpful if a company kind of curates those and presents a list of resources. It can be very hard. I feel very overwhelmed by how much information is out there about what I could be doing with my kids, and having someone kind of go through that and offer that up to me, it would be very helpful. We heard many companies who are actually investing in employee equipment so they can work from home effectively and safely, and even stipends for internet connectivity. I think, while social distancing is easing in some areas, it's highly likely that companies, their actual physical office spaces will not be able to have as many people as they used to have in them on a daily basis, which means a lot of us will be working from home. And then what does that mean in terms of resources that were formerly provided in a physical office building or structure? Is that virtual resources need to be kind of much more robust than they were before. And so we're hearing things about providing mental health virtual resources where people can get information and support that they need, perhaps through access to therapists or virtual support groups and things like that. Another thing that companies can do is invest in employee development and in managers. So depending on what role you're in, some people can continue doing their same job just from home, but people who've worked in stores or other things, that they're more, it's difficult to actually do that job at home. And in any case, this presents a broader opportunity to enable people to develop themselves and their skill sets. So we heard from one company that does have stores that they're offering up their learning and development curriculum to store employees so that they can continue to develop themselves in their careers. I think people also benefit a lot from being invested in, and we need those kinds of supports, especially now. Managers in general, I think, are very hungry for solutions about how to manage in this moment. And I'm going to talk about more of that in depth in the next few slides, but offering webinars with guidance for managers, there's just significant demand. We heard from a company that offered a webinar and like 1,200 managers took advantage of it. So I think there's a real, hunger out there for these kinds of things. Getting back to Alison's point about what appears to be not a lot of communications, really in a time of uncertainty like this, transparent and frequent communication is actually just essential. And so some companies were thinking through, what does frequent leader communication look like, and what things should be communicated. We'd love to hear what's happening for you all at your companies in different workplaces. And another innovative idea was to offer some office hours to provide support or answer questions. Office hours provided by HR, some other functions to really help people, supply people with the opportunity to get the information that they need. Alison, can you advance the next slide? So then what leaders can do, sort of similar, which is that you need to, once expectations have been adjusted or the thought process has been adjusted about what productivity looks like, what work-life management looks like now, it's really paramount that leadership starts communicating on these issues. So we've heard that there's a range of strategies that companies are pursuing, from CEOs convening all hands meetings and really explaining that we are living in a new normal, that people are working at home during a crisis. And so work actually has to look different, and that that's okay. And the employees hearing that you have permission to not be working at the pace and rate that you did before was very helpful. CEOs are also, some anyway, are modeling inclusion and of family and at work, and sometimes in virtual meetings, kind of having either their kids or their extended family or even their dogs in the background to just kind of humanize the situation, and that we're all living through it together. I think right now leaders have this really unique opportunity and unique responsibility to lead with that kind of authenticity and transparency and empathy in a moment that none of us have lived through. And when what we're hearing from our corporate partners and our other contacts in industry is that when leaders act as human beings and are vulnerable, it can really make employees feel connected and more supported. Another issue that, to build on what Alison talked about, the increase in racism, particularly towards Asian Americans, that this kind of discrimination needs to be talked about and addressed head on. We've heard about a CEO in a town hall explicitly addressing the racism that some of their employees, Asian employees, had experienced, often offering kind of solidarity and the strong stance that the company has against racism. So acknowledging this kind of broader public dynamic that's happening where Asians are being sort of scapegoated and attacked and targeted, and offering, not kind of outwardly and explicitly stating that they won't condone it, can be also very helpful for groups that are experiencing these kinds of things. Another issue that was brought up is not to make assumptions. I think in the media and press more broadly, there is a almost hyper focus on sort of the nuclear heterosexual family with children. And that's a huge amount of people in our country and in our world, but it's not the only group. As Alison went through, we have many different types of families and people in various stages of their life. And so it's incumbent on leaders to really educate themselves about the variety of challenges and experiences that their employees are going through and their employees' families are going through. Talking with different employees about their lives, getting a real sense of the continuum of experiences out there, and then from there being able to design organizational solutions with employees' feedback, so that these strategies around inclusion maintain an intersectional lens and aren't just geared towards one demographic of employee. Planning ahead is going to be pretty important. Every day it feels like things are kind of changing. And I think we all get the sense that this uncertainty and sort of volatility will be around with us for a while as we ease social distancing and see what happens. We may have to engage in social distancing again. And we know there's a lot of economic damage and layoffs and things like that. So leaders really need to be scenario planning for what different versions of what's next, what they look like, and communicating back to employees is really important. Employers are also focused on keeping people connected. That's what we were hearing, is holding social events even across the globe. And in some ways that facilitates inclusion, because if you had a team with people in different parts of the world, sometimes it was just the people at the headquarters of the company that hung out. And now these virtual events are actually allowing people to hang out together no matter where they are. So that's sort of a bright spot on inclusion. Alison, can you advance? So for what managers should do, one of the things we heard that makes a lot of sense once you hear it is that it's a new managerial landscape out there, heightened uncertainty and anxiety, and it's critical for managers to actually invest in their own self-care. As someone said, put on your own oxygen mask before helping others, so that you can effectively support your team in the long run. Also, having a growth mindset, it's always beneficial, but right now, learning about how the pandemic is impacting employees in different parts of the world and learning lessons can be very valuable. And then even just learning from other peer managers in your home area. So one company had managers in Asia Pacific and Europe who were sort of dealing with the pandemic before the United States were interviewed about lessons they were learning about, how to lead inclusively, and managers in North America were really listening and considering how they would implement those kinds of things. So knowing also that there's no way managers are going to get it right, at least all the time out of the gates, because we've never lived through anything like this before. Again, managers need to accelerate employee communication and lead with empathy. So modeling effective work-life behaviors, sharing in that sense of uncertainty, helping employees really prioritize what tasks need to get done, especially if you have limited bandwidth, and then the systematically checking in with employees. The check-in has probably never been more important in terms of a managerial practice than right now. And that can be hard because people are on very different schedules. And so managers many are kind of looking for different ways of managing the communication, from text to email to Zoom calls, all of these things. But thinking through what makes sense for employees is really important, and not just assuming that one way of communicating is going to be good for everybody. And in a broader sense, paying attention to these details really matters for inclusion. So what's also interesting is in real time, we're living in a different moment and trying to establish new practices in all different parts of our life, really. But one of them that we've been hearing about is how to manage virtual meetings. Now, a lot of us have been on Zoom calls and had virtual meetings for a long time. Other companies are newer to this, but no matter where you are, really thinking through the ground rules of virtual communication, like how are you going to manage airtime? How are you going to establish norms of collaboration? And managers play a really critical role in establishing these team norms. You want to make sure people aren't interrupting each other, that someone isn't dominating the conversation. So establishing ground rules is really, really essential right now. And of course, while psychological safety is always important, it probably matters more now when everyone's feeling vulnerable and uncertain. So asking for input, demonstrating openness and humility, setting up these check-ins, these office hours, can really prove beneficial to so many employees. Okay, Alison, the next slide. So what we know before the pandemic from a research perspective is that employees who reported receiving more support from their supervisors on work-family issues had reported lower work-life conflict, which isn't surprising. There's a whole literature on what are called family supportive supervisor behaviors. And when managers engage in those, there's a lot of good outcomes, both for individuals and for organizations. So individuals report greater job satisfaction, greater job engagement, higher job performance, greater well-being, lower turnover and tensions. And it's not surprising, but it's really important to emphasize that supervisors play a really critical role in interpreting policies. They function as gatekeepers on a lot of policies. Remember, a long time ago, I was interviewing fathers who work in high-tech companies, and a lot of them were getting a couple weeks of paternity leave that was completely off the books. It was just sort of the informal thing they worked out with their manager. So supervisors are really important in all of this. And there's a few different ways that supervisors can provide support, emotional support, like, you know, I can talk effectively with my supervisor to solve these kinds of conflicts, even instrumental support where a supervisor is helping resolve scheduling issues. I mean, I can imagine right now that teams trying to schedule a Zoom call or whatever, there's going to be supervisors for like the call is at X time and everyone has to be there. And then there's other supervisors who are going to take more care and try to find a solution that meets everyone's needs. Role modeling was important before the pandemic, and I imagine it's even more important now, that how your supervisor role models working and non-work activities in their life is going to enable you, it's going to signal what is okay and what is allowable, and also give you something to emulate. And also being creative in work-family management. When supervisors think about, you know, how work can be done differently so that I don't have to make trade-offs between work and family. When people reported that their manager could do that, there were better outcomes. So as I think all this through, so much of everything we've been talking about is really going to come down through managers, middle managers. They're going to communicate the expectations from the company's perspective about productivity, about what's possible, about the resources the company has. And we can't just assume that managers know how to do any of this. And while manager training is always critically important, right now they need to be provided with specific kinds of skills and insights so that they can be the kind of manager that the pandemic is really requiring. And they're the ones who really can help address many of the biases that a lot of people are worried are going to get exacerbated in this moment. Disabilities about mothers, people with bias against people with disabilities, bias, and all kinds of ways that hurt people in the workplace before the pandemic, but may get exacerbated now. So with that, Alison, what's our next slide? Bright spots for inclusion. And we'd love to hear from you all too about this. We heard that telework has this potential to increase teamwork across geographies. This FaceTime is being challenged. I think there was a lot of companies that had a culture where FaceTime really mattered, and overnight they had to let go of that. So new norms hopefully will be created in their, come into and replace those FaceTime norms. New norms about inclusion. I was joking that, the Zoom raise hand function may be like a silver bullet in inclusion because it prevents people, prevent people from interrupting each other. We heard stories about younger employees mentoring more senior employees, which kind of creates opportunities for relationship building and sharing of knowledge, which was kind of boosted the role of younger employees. Increased empathy across employees about work-life conflict. I think we're seeing each other as really human and understanding each other's personal challenges, mental health challenges, and bonding over that. I doubt HR, L&D, and DEI folks have had it very easy. I think they are key in supporting employees during this time, and they've had, I think the companies that come out the strongest will have figured out how to use those functions as best they can, and having them be takes front and center on thinking all of this through, because it's incredibly difficult. But if they can get the resources they need and be listened to, I think those are the companies that are going to do better in the long run. And there's talk about fathers taking a more active role in childcare. So that's something that we may see continue once the pandemic wanes a bit. And with that, we can have a broader discussion now. Carolyn, I'm not sure if there are certain kinds of questions coming in or a theme that we could talk about.
Hello. So we've had a few ideas exchanged on chat. So for example, how do you deal with people wanting to remain connected and organizing all these events, and yet people are experiencing some very real Zoom burnout? And so some of the examples, Rachel proposed, for example, they have video participation through a call-in method versus a call-out method. So instead of requiring people to join via video, you can tell people that they're welcome to turn them on or off depending on their personal preference, right? And that's something we've tried to do in our meetings as well. So the research shows that paying attention to so many faces on the two-dimensional plane is really cognitively taxing for people. And that's why we're so exhausted after an hour of Zoom, because our brain is wired to pay attention to faces. So maybe right now we could either do a Q&A, or if you want, we could do the raise hand function. So we could do Q&A through chat, or we can do the raise hand function and ask people to submit questions or their ideas for what they've seen work with inclusion.
I'm open, however people want to submit.
Okay, so maybe what we should do is see if anybody, do we have the raise hand function available to the participants, Glenn? Yes. So let's see if we can hear from some people. Do you have thoughts or comments or questions about the material that's been shared so far? Or do you have ideas about what you've seen work in your workplace to foster inclusion during a crisis? So the first person I'm going to call on is Kate Huber. Now, how do I unmute her? That is the question.
I can do that for you if you want.
Thank you, Walter. So Kate Huber has a question. There she is.
There you go.
Okay, hi everyone. Kate Huber here. I love some of the ideas that are coming up about how we can make things more inclusive and be more understanding of what people are going through. One of the things that we started doing that has worked out, it was an employee suggestion, was we're trying to record more things for all hands meetings like podcast style, as opposed to making everyone call in at the same time, because people are asking for flexibility, like I can't work between 10 and 11 because I need to take care of a parent, or I need to, so trying to do things more recorded versus live session and collecting questions ahead of time has worked out really well. We literally just started doing this like 2 weeks ago. So that's something I would throw out.
Great.
Yeah,
I love that.
Good.
It's the Stanford teaching is all online right now. And so instructors are also, they say, okay, it's a balance of synchronous and asynchronous. So if people are in different time zones or have different family commitments or constraints, they could have the option of still hearing the content in a asynchronous way. That's really great. Thank you for that suggestion. That's excellent. Anybody else would like to raise their hand? Questions, ideas? Oh, I see some hands here. Oh, sorry, it doesn't, okay, 2 attendees up there have a hand raised, so I have to like scroll. So Samantha Zeitlin. Here you go, Samantha, your turn.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so I've got a couple people on my team who are really, I think, experiencing sort of an emotional roller coaster a lot. So it's not so much that we have too many meetings. That's definitely a factor. But I think for us, the harder problem is feeling like we can concentrate for an extended period of time on the things that really require heavy technical work. And I'm trying to figure out how I can relieve some of the emotional strain on them, because I think they're just really struggling with feeling isolated, and then also having just a lot of distractions. You know, one person definitely said she felt disconnected from the company, where another one said they were just constantly distracted by family and pets and
Right.
furniture in their house. And those kinds of things.
Yeah, so the tension there is you have some people who would give anything for a moment alone, and then you have others who are completely isolated.
Mhm.
Any recommendations, Marianne and Alison?
Yeah, I think actually this is a recommendation that Marianne gave me for a project that I'm working on at the lab. And her recommendation was allow the people who have the time and really want to dive into the material to do that and kind of help carry the rest of the team forward. So I'm someone who is bombarded with the distractions right now. And so the idea of doing kind of deep thinking work, which it sounds like, a lot of the technical work that you're talking about might be similar, it requires a lot of concentration. And I'm like, I just don't have that right now. But some other people on the team do and are really seeking that. And so allow them to do that, and then maybe have touch points where I say, okay, I haven't been able to do anything over the last week, but you have. Can you update me and share with me what progress are you making? What questions are coming up for you? And that allows the whole team to move forward, and maybe, it kind of sparks some ideas for me as I'm hearing real time what she's finding. And so to the extent that the team, and this is similar to work that Leslie Perlow did, right, with BCG, and finding that when one person steps back, it can actually facilitate the rest of the team getting more involved and learning more about the project. And so there are ways that the whole team can move forward, even if individuals don't have the time or concentration that they used to. And then that can help me feel productive because if the rest of my team is moving forward, and I can share ideas on occasion, it makes me feel, like I'm contributing something.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And some skill sets and jump functions are harder than others to share with teams. But you see, for example, at Stanford, there's conversation about trying to redeploy people who don't have enough work right now because their job required them to be on campus. But then there's other labs or other groups, other departments that are completely overwhelmed, have too much work that can't be done because people are dealing with work-life challenges. And so we've been at Stanford trying to experiment with some sort of a matching process so we can deploy people with specific skill sets on different teams at different times. So that'll be interesting to see if that works.
Yeah. The other thing I would say is, and it's something we've been talking about the lab too, is of all the difficult thought, like heavy thought work involved things, are there discrete pieces that can be kind of that you could prioritize? So for me, I find taking calls and even reading a few things is fine. It's the deep thought work on writing that is quite difficult for me because I apparently am used to being in very quiet environments to do that. And I no longer have that. And I have people coming in and asking me for food and things like that. So, but I get overwhelmed and can be quite frustrated by that. And then I just was like, okay, well, write this thought today. Write about this thought. So really drilling down into the building blocks that lead up to a larger kind of deep knowledge thinking type of work can be helpful. And also that getting back to the growth mindset is like, we're going to have to try different ways of doing this, and some are going to work better for some people than others. But like maybe with your team, like what are 3 different ways we could think about trying to solve this problem, with expectation that like we might not get there, but let's at least try these different ways.
That's really great. And the other thing, I guess, for the employees, Samantha, that you're working with, I know personally, I felt completely overwhelmed and thought I can't possibly think right now. And yet, when faced with actually having to spend an hour doing something that required my full attention, I found it hard to make that transition. And yet at the end, I was like, oh, look, I didn't think about COVID for a whole hour. I want more of this. Please give me those challenging assignments right now. So sometimes you think there's absolutely no way you can do it. And then you realize what a blessing it can be. So, okay, I'm going to turn to Jenny Pinteritz. And then I have a question on the Q&A board as well. So Jenny, you can talk now.
Hi, yes. A couple of things. I'm at the Berkeley National Lab, and we've been doing a slew of things to enhance or to address some of the challenges. But we've also tried some things to enhance inclusion, and one of the most successful was having an open mic night. And this, for colleagues to see their colleagues and supervisors playing musical instruments or singing and doing all these kinds of things, just brought new dimensions to people's characters, and that was really useful. And tomorrow night we're having a virtual dance party, so we're really stretching and learning how to enhance inclusion in new ways.
That sounds wonderful.
Yeah,
I love
great.
that. I really like that. I like the idea of open mic night and having people share different talents. My husband's company that I seem to be living with right now too, in our household, they have a pet talent show activity. So my husband films our cat sleeping, but there are some dogs that do pretty impressive tricks on that, and it creates community. So that's wonderful. So Lorelei is asking on the Q&A chart, like how much advice, and this goes back to Marianne, to your concept of managerial supporting behaviors in work life. But where's the boundary? How much do managers should give advice on work-life integration and work-life situations right now? You know, she said some companies are giving resources about homeschooling, like here's what you do with your kids. And is there like a boundary you shouldn't cross? Is it overreach? You know, even like, for example, if an employee is struggling because they're in a dual career, when do you say, well, maybe your partner should take more of the load? Like, when do you go there?
That's a big question. I don't know that there's a clear boundary right now. I think if it's coming from a place of trying to be helpful and kind of brainstormy, as opposed to kind of prescriptive and didactic, I think it's the tone and the place that it's coming from. So like, I mean, if you just imagine two different scenarios, like sending out, oh, here's a list of like fun activities or activities that look like fun to do with your kid, versus like, here's a list of things, try to do 4 of them a day with your kids. I mean, there's just like a different tone to it. I think the optionality of it might be important. Yeah, the more, you know, I think how to interact with your kids or activities to do with your kid feels a little bit different than getting into the meat of, you know, inequality and interpersonal relationships, and the reality that most straight couples have some degree of gender inequality baked into them. And so even just, I think there's different ways of talking about that. One is to, you know, acknowledge and commiserate, and others are sharing tactics for like, well, how did you get to a more equitable division of things, and just being candid about all of that. I really think right now when people are vulnerable and not trying to like be judgmental or prescriptive, it'll come across better. So I don't know that there's a line that I can say like this is crossing the line and this isn't. I think it's more the intentionality and spirit behind these things that will matter. And you will get it wrong. Some people will get annoyed or whatever, but you can just keep trying.
That's a really good point.
And I think also the you know, the stats are showing with the 90% of people wanting this communication and wanting people to check in with them, I think it sort of indicates that if you're so afraid to say the wrong thing that you don't reach out, that's probably worse. Right. People really are craving, you know, connection and communication from their companies and from their managers, and even just that personal check-in of, hey, how are you doing? Are you okay? You know, the survey was showing that people really, really appreciate that. So I think, you know, as Marianne said, you probably will say the wrong thing at one point or another, but it's probably better to go ahead and try anyway.
That's really useful. There's an initiative starting at Stanford also to encourage people to form peer cohorts to discuss these challenges and help each other, right? So then you may create safe spaces where people can really discuss these things not necessarily with their manager, but with colleagues that are also grappling with the same issues, and where they can find some support and ideas as well. Okay, anybody else want to raise their hand? And if not, I do have another question coming up, so let me see. Anybody else want a hand raise? Or I will read the next question that I have. Okay, so I have one hand raised. Now I have to find it. There should be a way to sort.
Very cool.
Okay, thank you. Good, thank you, Walter. Go ahead. Eric? Eric Cole?
Okay, now I'm unmuted. All right.
Ah, here you are. Thank you, Eric.
I wanted to contribute something as somebody who's been a 13-year work from home person.
Wonderful.
You know, you come into this new situation sort of maybe thinking, well, nothing has changed for me. I've been doing this for 13 years. But really, it is not normal compared to what normal was before.
Yeah.
You know, a spouse who's now working from home. I have a kid who's home from college, doing college from home. I have a kid who's living at home and is, you know, out as an essential worker in the world every day. And I think it's important for people to understand, especially if you manage people, I think, that have been doing this for a while, that it's not just business as usual for them anymore. This has changed. And so I think we all need to be cognizant of the fact that even if we're an experienced professional at doing this, it is not quite the same. And we also need to be looking for ways to help members of our team, or maybe people that report to us who are not used to working from home, who are trying to work through all this now, what we can be doing to try to make life easier for them in a transition to this as well.
That's an excellent, excellent insight. There was something going around on Twitter, which our faculty director repeated. It said, "You're not working from home. You're at home during a crisis trying to work," right? Which, like you said, this is not your normal work from home. At the same time, it sounds like, Eric, people who have been working from home for a long time could also be incredibly useful sources of knowledge right now, right? So you could invite, like in a company as managers or leaders, you could invite, you know, on a webinar, webinar best practices for lessons learned from your 14 years of working from home, and how this situation is different, and how you're adjusting to it based on your existing kind of best practices to do this effectively.
Absolutely.
That's really great. Thank you so much for this.
Yeah, I worked from home too before this, and it was quiet then. It was just me and my dog. And I actually liked it because it was like, you know, not overhearing anything, and super silent. And that's not this. And I mean, the broader thing I think there are pros and cons to it is, and as a lab, we've talked about this, which is, it's really great that we've sort of normalized working from home, because there was a lot of pushback to even, like, so many jobs can't be done from home. And while many really technically can't, it was always kind of a cultural roadblock in many companies who just couldn't get into the mindset that people can work flexibly. And so it's really changed that. The myth that people can't work from home has been undone. The question, though, is that we're doing this experiment in the most not ideal circumstances, right? Which is, it's one thing to work from home when you're just at home and your family is out at school and at their jobs and whatever. It's another thing to be at home with your family members all the time. So it's not, I think there's, with a lot of the dynamics happening, it's a push and pull. It's a force for creating more flexible work. But if people are less productive, then there might be kind of some pushback to that. So we'll see how it plays out.
There's a question on the board, and I think we have time to answer a last question. And this one is more about networking. Do we see that people are kind of turning down connection requests or speaking requests, or, you know, or is there an opportunity to open up connection requests? And are people really open right now? Like if you want to reach out to a potential sponsor or a mentor, is that a good opportunity to do it? Or are you just going to get, are you crazy? Like I'm struggling right now and I don't have time for you.
Mm-hmm.
And this is an interesting question because we do wonder, as everybody is now at home, are some networks being consolidated, further reinforced, and others now are just not happening? So any thoughts that you have about networks during this crisis?
All of that. All of that is, so, I mean, if you don't have if you don't have the opportunity to bump into someone in the hall, like maybe you used to in an organic way, can we facilitate that in a different way? And I think in terms of whether or not it's a good time to reach out to somebody I generally would not give the advice to like, don't reach out to someone and formally ask them to be your sponsor. Like that's probably not a great strategy. But I think the optionality kind of theme that we've talked about during this session is important, is, reaching out to someone and saying, love to connect for, a 30-minute Zoom. Let me know if, you have time for that in your calendar, or if it would be better for me to reach back out in 3 months to you. So that you're not kind of demanding someone's time, but just kind of signaling, I'd love to connect, understand if it's not the right time. And that may be a more viable strategy right now than, a lot of, in terms of sponsors, to the degree that people are really thinking about reaching out to very senior people, I think very senior people at companies right now are completely slammed dealing with this. So not that they don't want to talk to people, but that I'm guessing maybe waiting at least a little bit of time until things get, I'm not going to say back to normal because I don't think that's going to happen, but you may have a higher rate of success. But if it's just reaching out to colleagues that you used to see occasionally and you just want to check in on, I think saying, I'd love to set something up like this week or a month from now, whatever your availability is a great idea.
That's wonderful. And as anecdotal evidence, I am the thesis advisor of an undergraduate student at Stanford right now, and she wanted to interview women in top leadership roles for her thesis, and it's under a tight timeline. And so I was like, oh, I don't know how that's going to go. And every single outreach email that I have sent was received with absolutely, I would love to talk to you. I will make time, so there's also a beautiful spirit of people wanting to give back and being very generous in terms of creating connections. And maybe for some having, if depending on their home situation, even if they are swamped with leadership responsibilities, they may welcome the opportunity to connect and help somebody's career. So thank you so much. We're about to end. I will turn it back over for the wrap up and close.
Great.
Okay, so we had some questions that we didn't need because you all were able to generate your own. But thank you so much for participating, for sharing your ideas, and being here to talk about these very pressing, important, and difficult, challenging issues. And we have some information on the slide there if you want to follow up with our lab. But we were really glad to be here. And, this is a conversation that is going to have to continue. As Marianne said, we are real time figuring this out. So I think this is definitely a moving target, and it will evolve a lot over the next couple weeks, months. But I think we're really grateful that it seems like a lot of organizations are keeping diversity, inclusion, and equity top of mind. We hear a lot the phrase "now more than ever." It's important now more than ever, and so I think that's where we're at as well. And so thank you for being here, for prioritizing this, and good luck. Stay healthy.
Yes. And please reach out to us if you have any further thoughts, or if you sort of see things happening at your company or other companies that you think are relevant to what we talked about today, we're very eager to keep learning and keep understanding what's happening on the ground. So please reach out, and thank you for joining.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much. Great session.
Thank you, Glenn.
All right. Bye.
Bye.